Hi, I'm Jenny Miller and welcome to my YouTube channel. Are you looking for tips and tutorials to help make your sewing journey easier? Then you are in the right place. Just be sure to click that subscribe button so you don't miss any of my tutorials, and let's get sewing. Today we are talking about gathers. And gathering your fabric is any time that you take a longer piece of fabric and gather it up or pleat it up like this to fit into a smaller piece of fabric, creating this ruffled effect in the process. Now, gathers can be a ruffle like this, it can be around the waist of a skirt, it can be a lot of different applications. And so one of the reasons I wore this blouse today is to show some ruffles that are gathers in this particular pattern. We have them here on this ruffle. We also have them around the top of the sleeve, and the process is the same. So that's what I want to talk about today. Like I said, this is a longer piece of fabric being pleated up and fit into a smaller space. And so I brought a pattern piece from this particular top. This is the sagebrush top. It's by the Friday Pattern Company, a really fun pattern. And so I wanted to pull this out and show you. This is the pattern piece for the actual ruffle here. And it was cut on the fold, so that would be the center. And you can see that this piece was much longer than where my actual blouse ends. And so we had to pleat that up or gather it up to fit it into this space and to get that effect. In the same way, these sleeves were much bigger at the top than the actual armscye, and so we had to do the same thing to get them to fit into the sleeve hole, and that's what creates the puffier gathered sleeves. So let's talk about how we get gathers in our fabric. So as I showed you, when you're making gathers, you're taking a longer piece of fabric and bringing it in to be the same length as your main or base fabric by gathering it or pulling it up in little tiny pleats. And so to do that, we have several different methods. And for both of those methods, you're going to want to determine where your seam line is. Now, I have marked that on this fabric so that you can see it. But you'll have to look at your pattern to see, is it a 5/8 inch seam allowance, a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and go from there. And then you can either mark it in like this, as I said, or look at the needle plate markings and make sure that you sew to the side of this seam line. Because once we've put the gathers in, we're going to sew the seam along here, and you don't want to catch the other stitching in that. And that will make more sense in just a second. So the first technique I want to show you involves just simply making 2 rows of basting stitches, one on either side of this seam line. And so you need to set your machine to the longest stitch length that you have. Mine goes up to a 6mm stitch, and that's what I like to use. But if yours only goes up to 5mm, which a lot of machines do, that will work just as well. Just set it to that length, and I will show you once I have stitched 2 rows of stitching on here. Okay, now I have sewn my 2 rows of basting stitch. I did back stitch at this end to lock down my threads, but I do not want to back stitch at this end. And let me show you why now. I am going to get a hold of my 2 bobbin threads. The bobbin threads tend to be just a little bit looser and allow you to pull up your gathers a little more easily. And so I've got a hold of those 2 threads, and my 2 top threads are loose here. I did forget to mention that you do want to make sure that you leave a long tail of threads at this end so that you can get a hold of them. So now I've got a hold of the long tail of my 2 bobbin threads, and I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the gathers, working them along the fabric as I go, to try and keep them even and from bunching up too much. And so I want this piece now to be the same length as this piece. And so I just kind of hold them together and measure until I've got them the same length. Now at this point, it doesn't matter how even my gathers are. I'm going to go ahead and tie off these 2 bobbin threads now so that they cannot pull loose, or the gathers can't pull out on the threads. And so I like to make 2 knots just to be sure. And we want those knots to be tight here against the end of the fabric so that we can't pull the gathers back out. And so now my two pieces of fabric match up at the same length. Now I can start taking these gathers and spreading them evenly across the length of my strip so that they look nice. You don't want to have a flat spot like this in your gathers. Just gently push them, and when you get a flatter spot, push some of them back to that point until you're happy with how evenly the gathers are distributed across your fabric. Now you can see that I probably did not tie my knots quite tight enough. Some of the gathers have pulled out to where this is just a little bit longer. I'm not going to panic over that. Let me show you what I'm going to do. Because gathers are just pleating this fabric up in, I'm just going to make my own little gathers by pushing this up at the end. So when I go to sew my ruffle onto the base fabric, I am going to pin it at the two ends so that they are matching up exactly. So I put one pin at this end first. This was my end where I back stitched. This end turned out just a little bit too long even after I tied this off. So I'm just going to pull those on up the threads now and pin that one in place right here at this end. So now my piece is exactly the right length. I'm going to make sure those gathers get pushed where I want them. And then making sure that my raw edges are even, I'm just going to pin across here like I would with any seam that I'm sewing. I might use a few more pins than usual just to hold those gathers in place and keep them from slipping on me, but I'm just going to put my pins in like that. And now, if you remember, it was marked on the right side of the fabric, but my seam line is right down the middle between these two lines of thread. And so I'm going to stitch that seam, and that will hold my gathers down to the other fabric. When I sew my gathers onto my base fabric, I'm going to use my regular stitch length, which I typically sew with a 3 or a 3.5 millimeter stitch length. If you prefer a 2.5 millimeter, that works. Whatever stitch length you're using to sew your clothing, that's what you're going to use to sew this on, because this is going to be your final seam. When I am sewing my gathers on, I like to put them down so that the feed dogs can kind of push my gathers through and help me. Anytime you can have your sewing machine help you, by all means, use it. So I'm going to do this at my 5/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to back stitch at both ends as I'm sewing, removing my pins. When I get to the other end, I want to back stitch again. And then I can trim off all of my threads now. I don't need any of my long tails. And you can see my stitches going mostly between my two seams. I got a little bit off here with my ruffles. That won't be the end of the world, but you want them to generally be between your two rows of basting stitch. Now that we have sewn our gathers onto our fabric, you can see that if I flip it this way, you can see the one row of basting stitch here. So for sure, that one needs to come out. I also like to pull out this top row of basting stitch just because it makes it look better on the inside of my project, but that's up to you whether you want to do that or not. So I'm just going to cut these ends. And because this was a basting stitch, it will typically come out really easily. So I'm just going to clip those and pull. And again, you'll want to pull that bobbin thread. It's going to come out so much easier than the top thread. Then I'll just flip to the outside, and that top thread will come right off. Where I back stitched, it stuck just a little bit. I'll just take a seam ripper and get those out. But now my basting stitches are removed, and I can get rid of this one as well. I'm getting some fraying going on here. I'll just clip some of that off. And now all of my basting stitches are removed from the fabric, and I have my gathers. Now you'll notice when I flip this to the right side of the fabric, in a few places you can see my seam line that I drew. I wasn't absolutely perfect in getting everything matched up here, but it's not going to be a problem at all when I push this back and press that into place. And in fact, to draw this seam line, I used a heat erasable pen, so the iron will just make that disappear. But like I said, typically I just use the marks on my needle plate to know whether I'm sewing on either side of the seam line, and so I don't have to worry about anything showing when my gathers are done. Okay, the second method of gathering that I want to show you involves dental floss. So I have not marked my seam line on here. I'm going to show you in just a second how I use the marks on my needle plate to be sure that I'm not sewing on my seam line, but we are going to use this dental floss to actually pull up the gathers. This is especially helpful if you have a very long piece that you're trying to gather in. If you use the basting stitch method on a very long piece, as you're gathering it in, those threads, those basting threads, are going to start to break on you, and it can become very frustrating. And so using dental floss, or you could use yarn or any other type of string in exactly the same way, is much stronger, and you're going to be able to pull up the gathers. It's also very helpful on a very thick or stiff fabric. This is going to work much better, again, because it's stronger and those basting threads won't break on you. So let me show you how we're going to do this. So just like my basting lines, I don't want to sew exactly down my seam line. I want to be just to the side of it. And actually with this method, I like to be just to the inside of it. So to the left of my seam line. So if I were sewing a regular seam, I would be using this mark right here on my needle plate to sew it. So if I go over to the very next line, now I know that I am just to the left of my seam line, and I'm going to go ahead and lower my presser foot to hold it in place. Then I'm going to set my machine to a zigzag stitch. And I want that zigzag to be wide enough to go over the floss or the yarn, whatever I'm using, without stitching through it. This needs to be free so that we can pull up the stitches or pull up the gathers. And so I'm going to make my width of my zigzag wide enough to make sure that I'm going over that. Then I'm going to lower my needle into the fabric just to hold it in place so that I can lift my presser foot and put the floss underneath. Now you can cut your floss ahead of time if you want to the length that you need. I find it just as easy to hold it in my hand like this. But I've got a tail of floss out the back. I'm going to lower my presser foot now and make sure that that floss goes right down the center of my presser foot so that I know that my needle will go back and forth over the top of it without catching it. So I've got it there in the center, and now I'm going to just start zigzagging a few stitches and back stitching for a few. Oh, and I forgot to use my needle down button. Using your needle down button is a big help with this because you're going to want your needle in the fabric if you need to lift your presser foot. So I'm going to zigzag a few and back stitch a few. And now with the needle down in my fabric, I can lift my presser foot, take the other end of that floss, and I am going to actually tie it here in a knot so that I know for sure that it is attached at this end, because just like the basting stitch, we need one end to be finished off and the other end to be loose so that we can pull the gathers up. And so I'm going to tie that into a knot and then put my floss back down in exactly the center of my presser foot so that I know I won't catch it with my zigzag stitches. And now I'm just going to go ahead and zigzag along here, going over the floss and keeping the edge of my fabric even with my marking here that I know is about 1/8 of an inch off from my seam line. And if you need to, go a little bit more slowly with this method, that's fine. I'm keeping an eye on the edge of my fabric and an eye on the floss so that I'm not catching it in my stitches. And I'm going to go to the other end. Now, I can go ahead and back stitch again at this point, being sure not to catch my floss because I don't want my zigzag stitches to pull out. And then I can lift my needle and I've got it in. And at this point, I can also trim my floss. Okay, when I got to the end of stitching this row, I realized I had left my nippers sitting over here at the cutting table. So now I'm going to trim off this end, and you'll see that floss is sturdy. It doesn't really like to cut very easily, but I'm trimming those off and I am leaving a tail of floss at this end. And then just like with the basting stitches, I am going to pull up my gathers until my piece of fabric is the same length as my base, until my ruffle is the same length as my base of fabric. Just like that. Now, this is a little more complicated to tie off this floss, but I can tie it to the ends of my zigzag, or my thread from my zigzag stitch, but you can see it's pulled out just a little bit. So a little bit trickier at the end, but go ahead and pull that up. And remember, if it is a little bit long, we can still make it work. So just go ahead and tie that to the threads so that you don't lose your ruffles off the end while you're trying to pin things together. And now that that's tied together, I can pin it to my fabric just like before. I want to start by pinning my ends in place. And then you can get your gathers even beforehand or after you get it pinned. I find that there's a little bit of both going on because some of them scooch around as you're pinning. But then I can go ahead and put these pins in just like before. And this time, when I sew my regular seam to sew them together, remember we put this just to the left of that seam line, and so my seam should run right along here. Now we want to try to be careful not to catch that floss in the seam, because then when you go to pull the floss out, it's stitched in place and sometimes can be a little bit messy. So my best advice is to use a lot of pins to really hold this nice and straight. You can see this is straight. Now we have a little scoop here. I don't want that scoop because that's where I start to run into problems with catching the floss in the seam. And now I'm going to go sew these two together. Again, when I do it, I'm going to put my gathers down towards the feed dogs so that they'll help me keep them in place. Now that I have my seam sewn, I can go ahead and cut off all of my threads at the end. And as you can see, here is the zigzag line from my gathers. So that's what I want to remove at this point. And we need to make sure that we get rid of all of this back stitching because that's where we tied the floss to the thread. And we want to be able to pull that out as well. And so I'm just going to get in there and make sure that all of that is trimmed. I want to get this end. This is where we pulled up the gathers. And remember, I tied it to the threads as well so that it wouldn't pull out. And then once we've done that, we can just start to remove the zigzag seam. One disadvantage to this method is that zigzag stitches don't like to pull out as easily as a simple basting stitch. So I didn't want to bore you by making you watch me pull that out, but you can see now I've removed my floss, I've removed the threads, and I have a ruffle. A few things that you want to consider when you're trying to decide which method to use is this. The reason we did 2 rows of the basting stitch to make these gathers is twofold. First of all, having the 2 rows means that if either of the threads breaks on you while you're gathering, you still have 1 row of stitching to do those gathers. Also, having it gathered here and down here and sewing up the middle ensures that your gathers are nice and even when you sew them together or sew them to your foundation fabric on your machine. The advantage to using dental floss or yarn is that it is super strong, like I said, and won't break. And that way, if you're doing a lot of gathers, maybe for a ruffle around a skirt or a tier to a skirt, you could be working with a piece that's over a yard long. And for sure, your threads are going to start to snap if you're trying to gather it by this method. And so for something like that, I would definitely use the yarn or dental floss method. I hope you have found this helpful. Gathers can be a lot of fun in a project, especially if you're making little children's clothes, but even for us older people. They can be a fun little accent. They can make your sleeves much nicer. They can give you fullness where you need fullness in your garments. So knowing how to gather and get even gathers is just a good skill to have. So practice on some small scraps like the ones that I've used here for my demonstration. See how you like the different methods and see which one works best for you. And so let's get sewing.